Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to the Cool Kids Lunch Table Podcast with PJ and Mike. Now find yourself a seat at their table.
Hey kids, I'm Mike.
I'm PJ.
And today we'll be talking about the process of writing a novel, becoming an author, and the day in the life of being a poet. And to help us out, we'll be interviewing author and poet John Yemrus to discuss his new books, his new memoir, The Street, and the volume of poetry entitled People and Other Bad Ideas. Hi, John. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. This is really interesting. You guys introduced me as talking about how to write a novel. That's a bit of a lie because in the course of my 39 published books, I did write and publish 2 novels, but they were really, really shitty. And the only thing I learned and the only thing I could teach from them is that I am not a novelist. So I could teach you about writing books of poetry, but I can't teach you about the process of writing a novel.
That's no problem. But I'm going to read a little bit for the folks at home more about John. So John has been working as a writer for over 5 decades. His first book came out in 1970. Since then, he published 39 books, mostly poetry, but including 2 novels, three memoirs, and a children's book. Several of his books have been appeared in translation. Many of his poems have been taught in dozens of college courses, and also been included in textbooks. His most recent books, like we're going to talk about today, are his volume of poetry, People and Other Bad Ideas, and his new memoir, The Street. Very exciting. And then PJ's going to give us a little quick synopsis of each.
So we have here is The Street. That's your newest book, right, John? Is The Street?
Well, but they came out within a week of each other, so they're kind of joined at the hip.
All right, because we have here The Street is ostensibly about the street where you grew up and about your childhood years, but it does encompass much more than that. It's a postmodern and often meta approach to storytelling. You show us what it was to live in a blue-collar town, coal town, in the Northeast, which may have been any working-class town anywhere in America, while at the same time obliquely discussing the nature of memory and consciousness, what it means to perceive through limited lens of ourselves. Also, because you're approaching your memoir through a flash fiction vignettes rather than an overarching narrative, creates a memory of a place more than an event or series of events. I think it's a very interesting idea. And then your other book is called The People and Other Bad Ideas, which is another collection of poems. And these poems ain't your blue-haired grandma's poems. You have to read them at your own risk. I love that. I think that's pretty funny. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the interview, let's just start with our childhood memory, like we like to do. So John, why don't you start off? Can you just tell us your favorite book that you read in high school or in your past? Really, it could be any time. Doesn't have to be high school.
Well, I just finished writing a 10-part series of articles on classic literature, and one of those 10 featured Treasure Island.
Oh.
We all read that as kids, but I read it again just a couple of weeks ago as an adult, and I just absolutely loved it. And right on the first page, you got yo ho ho and a bottle of rum, and I was just sucked right back into it. So, that brought back some childhood memories for me. And as a writer, memory is my stock in trade. A childhood memory. I remember riding a bike as fast as I could down to the corner, and a tricycle. And you know how tricycles take corners. So I would always hit that corner and end up on my ass. And I ended up writing about that bicycle and my ass and that corner. So, childhood memories, that's my stock in trade.
Yeah, so for me, when I was a kid, I always read comic books. Right, we've spoken about that on our show tons of times. I'm a comic book kid. That was what I always read, to the point where I have a comic book store of my own now. Right, that's what I do because I love comic books. Yeah, but in high school, I remember one of the books we read was To Kill a Mockingbird.
Love it.
And that became my favorite book because my favorite superhero is Superman, and I felt like Atticus had the qualities of a Clark Kent.
Oh,
You know,
he
Mm.
was.
uh,
And I always, whenever I think of that book, I think of Jet dressed up as the Ham for Halloween.
right? Yep.
Oh, great scene.
So that was always one of my favorite because I related it to the comic books that I loved reading. He had that sense of morality, right and wrong, fairness, and that was Superman in a nutshell to me. So when I read that book, and then even when I saw the movie, I looked at him like he could be Clark Kent. He looks like what Clark Kent's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
He acts like he's supposed to act, and that's what made me like that book so much. I couldn't bring myself to read the second one. I forget the name of it now.
Oh,
Yeah,
that was a mess.
Yeah,
There's a reason why she didn't
Go Set a
publish.
Watchman. That's what it's
right.
called. Yeah,
Yep.
I couldn't bring myself to read it. I heard nothing but bad things, and I
Yep.
love the original, and I couldn't bring myself to read that one.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, good pick, PJ. For me, I picked another old school one, The Great Gatsby. You know, I just always loved that book, man. I think I read it in my junior year of high school, and to this day, I always think about that book from like looking for green lights. So I think of now, I think in the part of the book, he remembers his own birthday, Nick Carraway, and you know, was it Mr. Wilson, and like something at the billboard, he sees the eyes. So like, I feel like that
The
book is.
glasses. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's it. Yeah, I just feel like, man, like it's so damn good. So
You know, you bring it up. I talked about that 10 article series I did on classics, and To Kill a Mockingbird and Gatsby, they're both on there, and you know those are just essential reading. And if people aren't reading them and familiar with them, they're really missing out. But in preparing, and I do, it may not sound like it, but I do prepare for these interviews and things. And preparing it, I looked up what you two do, and you guys talk about movies a lot, and I love movies. And I wanted to ask you, PJ, off the top of your head,
Yeah.
what's your favorite movie of all time?
Clerks.
Clerks. Wow.
wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And you?
I don't. It doesn't even take much. I don't have to think of it. That's been my favorite movie since I saw it in the '90s.
Wow.
Um, and I think I've probably spoken about it on some older episodes. But the reason I got so sucked into that movie was the subject matter they spoke about in the movie, right? Throughout the whole thing is Star Wars, it's superheroes, it was things that like me and Mikey would talk about in our lives, like every day.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden here comes this movie and it's a small picture, it's a small budget, it's not a blockbuster by any stretch, although it's gone on to become a huge cult classic. Um, but when I watched them, like it was like listening to myself.
Yeah.
Like these are the things that I say. These are the things that I sound like, and I got so enthralled with that. And I watched that movie and I said, well, if this guy, before I knew who Kevin Smith was, but I said if this guy can make a movie, maybe one day I can. I actually went to film school because I saw that movie,
Wow.
and I felt like I was that inspired by it because, again, it's nothing. It's no spectacle to watch in terms of cinematography or anything like that, but it's so relatable and the dialogue and the writing on that movie is just so perfect. You know, it's for its time it was perfect, but even looking back at it now, it's still relevant.
Still holds up.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
There's
How
a
about
joke
you,
in
Mike?
that movie that I laugh at because it takes place in the convenience store. And this was again the early '90s, right? So one of the customers in that convenience store buys a coffee and he drinks it and it's hot, and he goes, "You mean I have to drink this coffee hot?" And you laugh about it now because iced coffee
Yeah.
is a thing, but back then you couldn't get an iced coffee, so it's just
Do,
like,
do you know that there was a not a knockoff, but a movie made on the same premise a few years later called Inconvenience, you know, like in a
Huh.
convenience store.
Mhm.
And if Clerks was low budget, this was a low budget. And it was called Inconvenience.
hmm,
Uh, yeah, really, that was interesting too, but it was pretty much a ripoff of Clerks.
Huh.
wow, I haven't seen that one, but yeah, that is my favorite movie, and he's a when we talk about writers, I mean, yeah, it's a movie, but there's a lot of writing obviously that goes into it, and I think he's one of the best writers out there. He just doesn't get the credit he deserves, Kevin Smith. But yeah, that's my favorite. What's your favorite movie, John? Since you asked me, I'll ask it right back to you.
Well, probably There's probably three. Of course, Casablanca.
Mhm.
You know,
Oh yeah.
everybody loves that. Another one that's near the top is The Thing, not the remake, the one from
Right.
1951.
Yep. Oh
I
yeah.
love that. That had overlapping dialogue. You know, you had to really
Right.
listen to it. And for a low budget, semi low budget movie, it had layers of action. You could see business going off in the background and in the background of the background. It was really, really well done. And my all time favorite movie is probably On the Waterfront with
Oh, okay.
Brando.
Okay.
And of course, the scene in the taxi cab is probably, for my money, the greatest 6 or 7 minutes ever put on screen, ever.
Well, those are three classics right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're talking about great writing put on film. Uh, just for the writing, it has to be Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Mm.
Edward
Another
Albee's
classic. Yep.
play.
Yep.
Mike Nichols, the way
Oh yeah.
he made a lot of enemies putting that movie together, but it was worth it. It's a great movie, and it holds up today. How many 40 years later, 50 years later? So
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
yeah, 1967, I think it came out. But interestingly, Albee's play came out in 62,
Hmm.
kind of just at the end or the height of, you know, Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet and all that
Right.
stuff. And then
Right.
here comes Albee's play. And at the same time, there was a book called Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. If you're not familiar with it, pick it up. Yates, it was made into a movie a few years ago with Leonardo DiCaprio.
It was a great movie. Yeah.
Yeah, it flopped, but it was a great movie.
Hmm.
And if you ever have a chance, read the book by Richard Yates. It's better than the movie. And for my money, Yates was the best writer of dialogue of any writer I've ever encountered.
Hmm.
So that brings me to a question for you then, John. How did you get into being a writer? Like, what made you want to be a writer? Was it a book you read? Was it just something that clicked one day for you?
What clicked was girls.
Oh yeah.
You know, it was a way for me to meet girls. You could tell I'm a little guy, you know, so I wasn't on the football team or the basketball team. So it was my way to get to meet girls, and I found out that was the one little talent I had. So yeah, so that's how I became a writer. And the way I actually got my foot in the door as a writer, and I've told this story a million times, is I lied my way into a career.
Gotta fake it to make it.
True. I was starting out with my friend who was also an aspiring writer, and we were both bitching about how we couldn't get published anywhere because whenever we sent our work out, publishers would say, "This is nice, but where have you been published before, and what awards have you won?" And of course, the answer was always nothing and nothing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one night, we had just reached the bottom of a bottle of cheap Pop-Off vodka. I don't know if you remember Pop-Off vodka or if they even sell it anymore.
Yep. Yep. They still do.
Okay. We had reached the bottom of a fifth of vodka, and we were talking about how we couldn't get published anywhere. And he looked up at the street sign, and it was Oliver and Wakefield Streets. And he looked at the sign and he handed me the bottle of vodka and said, "I hereby award you the Wakefield Prize." True story. Next day, I sent off some poems to a magazine, pretty prestigious magazine at the time. It's now out of business. I sent them off, and I said, "I've recently been awarded the Wakefield Prize, hoping you'd take a look at my poems." I forgot about it. 3 weeks later, I get it. I was going to say email. I get a piece of mail back from the editor of the magazine saying, "I heard about you recently winning the Wakefield Prize. We'd love to publish your poems." And that's the true story of how I got my foot in the door as a writer. And I've been making stuff up ever since.
That's
Well,
awesome.
That's great. I wish I was deceitful enough to have thought of that. Years back, I had submitted to an independent comic book company an idea that I had for a comic book. I can't draw worth a shit, but I like to write a little bit. Certainly never got anything published. I never went that far with it, but I had an idea, and there was an independent company looking for people to write some stories for an anthology book they were coming out with. So I had a few ideas for a few short comic books or whatever. I sent it to them. They wouldn't publish it because for the same reason. Well, who are you? We don't know
Yep.
who you are, and they wouldn't even bother looking at it. So yeah, I wish I was clever enough to thought about just lying about it. That's a great idea.
I wasn't clever. I was just drunk and desperate.
Yeah,
And
sometimes that's all it takes. And
Ju-
you started off writing poetry right from the beginning. That was your thing.
Yes, yes. And I talked about those two bad novels that I published. That first novel, to talk about the art of suggestion. That first novel, when I sent it off to the publisher, who had already published 2 books of my poetry, and how the novel came about, was saying, well, the poems are selling okay, but we could do better if we had a novel. So I wrote up a novel really quick, fascinated by Kerouac. I wrote it up real fast, kind of like Kerouac. And being a 2-finger typer, I typed the whole novel in lowercase. And since I was hot to trot and hot to get it to the publisher, I sent it off as I wrote it in lowercase. And the publisher thought that I intended it to be published that way, in lowercase. Book came out. Book didn't sell much, but one review that I'll never forget talked about the lowercase writing, and it talked about the lowercase personal pronoun I, and it talked about the significance of me using the lowercase I to talk about the diminishing role of the individual in society, which the only intent I had was I could only type with 2 fingers. So that's the only intent I had with that lowercase I.
that's amazing. That's like
That's the only thing I ever learned about my 2 novels, is that they taught me I'm not a novelist.
yeah. John, I wanted getting to know John through our emails, setting up this interview, and before this, I says, John, you remind me of a movie, and I'm gonna toot my own horn, guys. I was totally accurate. So, John reminds me of Mr. Keating from Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams' character. And then, John, you just said, reasons why you became a writer is because you want to get women. And this is a quote from the film. This is actually 2 quotes I want to talk about. This is the first one.
Not very tired. He is exhausted. And don't use very sad use. Come on, Mr. Overstreet, you twerp.
Morose?
Exactly, morose. Now, language was developed for one endeavor, and that is, Mr. Anderson, come on, are you a man or an amoeba? Mr. Perry.
To communicate.
No, to woo women. Today we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare.
Oh, God.
I know. A lot of you look forward to this about as much as you look forward to root canal work.
But John, I'm really proud of myself. My instincts were correct. And I'm just curious, have you seen Dead Poets Society? And do you agree with my...
Yeah, I haven't seen it. It's one of those movies I'll always wish I had, but I totally agree with it. And I think when we were getting that little feedback and fumbling, that was probably you trying to find that quote.
Yes, yep. Mm-hmm. But yeah, John, I'm kind of curious. I want to kind of get into your books now, especially The Street. So I didn't read all of it, but I did a lot of it. So I guess, what made you want to write this memoir? Like, how did, this is The Street we're talking about. And I think it was actually released on when I got married on November 3rd, which I felt this was like talk about cosmic connection. But yeah, what inspired you to kind of write this book? And I want to talk about certain things inside this book that I really want to pick more of your brain about. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, the book, with my background of being a writer of poetry, and I refuse to call myself a poet, but I'm a writer of poetry. Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman are poets. I'm just a writer of poetry.
Gotcha.
But this is basically a poem with a thyroid condition. It's as PJ talked about. The book is a little different than a normal memoir. It's not linear in any way. It's
Yep.
more like jazz. It kind of bounces around and builds on one idea and bounces in another direction. It's kind of like a game of pool. I was reading today. I do read occasionally. No, I'm constantly reading. I was reading today that before Cézanne and his landscapes before Cézanne always had a way into the painting. There was always a way for the viewer, the audience, to get into the painting. And with Cézanne, there was the paintings just were, and the viewer, the audience, had to jump into the painting and become part of it. And that really hit me, because that's kind of the way I look at my poetry, that people have to jump into it and become part of the experience. And I talk about the thing that kind of kicked off that whole thing for me, because as you said, I've written 39 books, but I probably had published a good 10 or 12 books before I knew what the hell I was doing. And my aha moment was a very short 17-word poem. It went like this. Write a poem about that, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, smiling. And before I wrote that poem, previous to that, I would have continued writing and writing and writing, describing what all that was. But like Cézanne's paintings, I wanted the audience to jump into the poem and become part of the experience, to join with me in that feeling, and whatever they could imagine in their heads, describing whatever that was so much more powerful than what me as a stupid writer could come up with. And once I figured that out, that was a really powerful moment for me as a writer. That was my aha moment. I'm talking here. You guys.
That's okay.
No, it's
no.
great.
Yeah, so
We want to hear what you have to say, so it's great.
yeah.
There
So,
was a line in the street that stuck out to me, and I'll just bring it up. You had wrote in here that you said, "I read somewhere once that the dream is always killed by reality," and then you went on, and you talked a little bit more. But just that first sentence, I guess I read it at the right time, when that was sent to me when I was going through it, because, like I mentioned, having a comic book store, and that was always a dream of mine, right? And when I read that, I had a particularly trying day, dealing with some distributors and stuff, at the comic book store. And I sat there, and I finished up with the store. I was closed, and I was reading it, and then I read that line: "The dream is often killed by reality." And I had such a bad day where I like slammed my laptop closed at the end of the day, and I'm like, I can't believe this is what I always wanted to do for my entire life, and this is the bullshit I have to deal with. And then I read that line, and then I continued to read it, and I got lost a little bit in the book, and I kept going from there. But I just, that line struck me, and I guess it just came at the right time, because here I am doing the one thing I've always wanted to do, and I'm so aggravated by it. But when I read that in the book, it just kind of like snapped me out of it. And I was like, wait a minute, but this is a dream. So I just wanted to tell you that, while we were talking, because that did stick out to me as something that at that moment, I don't think there was another sentence I could have related to more. I just wanted to tell you that, because I thought you might appreciate it.
More than you know. As a writer, you live for those kind of comments. Being a writer is really a lonely occupation, if you want to call it an occupation. And hearing things like that really makes you feel good. So thank you.
Again, I thought it was perfect just for that moment. It really helped. So,
John,
now, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
yeah. So I want to talk about certain things about your book, and you talked about memories, and I want to read this from your book as well. So you said memories are like leaves on a tree. And they fall at different times, at different speeds, in different ways. Eventually, no matter how they fall, they end up covering the ground. And kind of like you said, your book is kind of like this jazz thing. And I'm going to kind of just go down these things that I just loved about the street. And I think PJ, actually, you might like this part. I'm sure you got this part in the book, but you talk about Black Mary, which was kind of like this figure, kind of like maybe the Boo Radley of your of your neighborhood. That I guess it was like an urban legend. If you looked at her,
Yeah, exactly.
That if you looked at her, you would turn to stone. And I think we all have those neighbors or people in our neighborhood somewhere in some other town. I remember, PJ, remember this house? I think it was in Massapequa, and the whole house was red. The sidewalk was red. Everything was red. You used to have candles in there.
Yep.
You used to
The Druid House. Yep.
Yeah, that one. And I think another part of the book I really enjoyed too. I think all of us, especially boys, I mean girls can play with balls too, but how going to that, you talk about your neighbors had this fenced-in yard. And it was like nothing got held. They had a fence that held nothing in, but held nothing out as well. Like kept nothing out either.
Yep.
And I really found.
Wire.
Yep. Another part for me that was just kind of very just deep, and I felt like it felt like very cinematic for me. It was like how passing on your father, how especially you described later on the book, he was almost like a relief picture, the way he walked, and he was a coal miner, and I think he changed careers, and he died very young, like 45, and just the way and when you found him, I don't want to spoil the book here, folks, but the way you found him, like in the imagery that you just spoke in the words, you kind of get going back to it. I was just like, it's just very powerful, the way you wrote that narrative. So, I just really, like I said, I keep going on and on about your book, but that section really, for me, about your father and finding him, and and it's really, I felt I was there. I felt I was with you, and not to sound more, but almost finding him, dead. I feel like I was there with you, kind of holding your hand, finding him.
Boy, you're making this old writer feel good. I want to read a poem from my book, Selected Poems, The Director's Cut.
Yeah, sure.
If I could. And that book, it's interesting. The book was going to be published, and the publisher wanted to do a 550-page retrospective, the best of my 52 years as a writer. And I said, 550 pages, you're nuts. You're going to lose your shirt. Nobody's going to want to buy 550 pages worth of poetry, much less my shit. And so we fought about it. And I got him down to a 384-page book. He published it, and it became his best-selling title up to that point. And he said, come on. Now you got to let me do it. Let's restore the book and do it the way I intended. 550 pages. And we fought for another couple of months, literally 2 months. And I gave in, and he published a 542-page expanded edition, which cinematic lover that I am, we called it Selected Poems, The Director's Cut. And Selected Poems, The Director's Cut came out, and for one day became #1 on Amazon in poetry.
Whoa.
Wow.
And so I was really happy about that. Let me read just one poem.
Of course.
Sure. Of course,
Selected Poems, The Director's Cut. And a lot of my poems are about my wife. You grow up writing about girls, and you grow old writing about girls. And the girl of my life is my wife. And here's a poem about her. You are a bowl of popcorn, a slim book of poems, and laughter during a moment of silence. You are pink bubble gum, a goddamn fool, and the only person in the world I care about. You are a clock with no hands, a blue bedroom, and a $20 bill. You refuse to accept the inevitable. You own way too many dresses, and you don't shoot pool. You are as uncomplaining as the sea. Ultimately, no one could put you into words, not even me.
Beautiful.
Very, very. You could feel the emotion in it.
Mhm.
Obviously, you really care about the subject that you were writing about there. You can tell.
Yeah, and you know that's kind of a good segue because, man, um, I definitely am a believer in destiny. So maybe this is because I was writing John back and forth setting this up. He wrote me a poem that he just came up with Tommy, which I maybe I'll read later on. But then he wrote this, and because I'm curious about where did that poem kind of come from? Because you wrote to me, I titled this little excerpt "Inspiration versus Consistency." He says, one other thing you might touch on is my instance that a writer has got to stay busy. Those writers who say they're not writing because they're waiting for inspiration are boneheads and unprofessional in their approach to the craft. I write every morning. Most of it is shit that ends up getting thrown out, but I write every morning. And I'm just like, in that poem, was that inspiration? Was that something you were really kind of like chiseling at? I feel it was like a big slab of marble and you were, you know, kind of carving it out.
Like I said, I just write every morning, and the good stuff, you guys know it. When it's good, you know
Oh yeah.
immediately
Oh
when
yeah.
something's good.
Yep.
You hear all the time. You hear musicians talk about, I didn't write that. I just happened to be there when it was passing by, and I grabbed
Yep.
it and wrote it down.
Yep.
So that's how I feel, and that's why I come down here in my basement every morning. I want to be there to be able to grab that stuff when it's passing by and write it down. And if I'm not down here, I'm missing out. I run into those aspiring writers. Um, I'll say, oh, "What are you doing now? What's next?" And they'll go, and they'll get all self-important, and they'll say, "Well, I'm not doing anything right now. I'm waiting for inspiration." And I want to punch them in the face, because if you're waiting for inspiration, you're not being very professional, and you're not treating the work with respect.
hmm
So,
Yeah.
so you said something interesting there that I was actually going to ask you about. Two things, actually. One, that you have a dedicated space carved out for where you're going to do your writing. You said in your basement, and you write every morning. Is that something that you feel you have to do? You have to be in your writing space, and you have to be in your writing time to be productive. Or
Good,
yeah.
good question. Good question. No, the answer is no. I make the time and the place to do the writing, but it happens anytime. You'll get inspired. I'll wake up in the middle of the night and run down here and write something down real quick. But I at least try to put myself in the position to succeed. Baseball players go out and catch grounders for 2 hours a day. You just got to practice. Um, you guys got me feeling like you mentioned that poem, Tommy, which is the
Yes.
new one, which will be in my next book. And I wanted to read another one that was
Sure.
written just this morning. She looked like someone who needed to be posing for a statue, like a scene out of an old movie. She stood there on the side of the road, lit a smoke, and blew him a kiss while he put the car in gear and drove away. That's it. The poems usually don't have any point. They're just little snapshots, like a little window onto what's happening, and I let the reader figure it out. And you mentioned Tommy.
Yes.
Let me
Yeah.
read that one to you too.
Yeah. I have it printed out, but yeah, I'd rather hear it from the. I'd rather hear you. I'd rather you. You'll read it better than me. Yeah. hmm
Tommy didn't know where he first heard it, and he didn't much care, because it described him perfectly. And whenever anyone would ask him how he was doing, he'd stop and say, "I started out with nothing and still got most of it left."
I love that last like stanza, man. That man, so good, so good.
That'll be in the next book.
Great.
Well, one of the things I appreciated while going through, some of the books, is it was very easy to read.
Yep.
And that's a big thing for me. I have the attention span of a goldfish on crack, right? I can't. As soon as someone jingles a set of keys, I'm gone. And I found, and you mentioned it again. You were just saying how they're short. And that's something that for me is great because I can read a few things, get a complete picture of what I read. If I put it down, I can come back to it. And I always appreciate writing that's like that. You know, everyone will tell you how great Lord of the Rings is and how great War and Peace is and all these other things. I can't get through a book that long with that many words. I can't get through a poem that's pages and pages long. I need something that grabs my attention and it gets me from start to finish in a reasonable amount of time before my brain takes me somewhere else. And I found that your books were like that. They weren't hard to get through. There wasn't. I had this be on, you know, in this book dived in for an hour, 2 hours straight just to get through it. And I appreciate a writing style like that. And you don't see. I feel like you see less and less of that because I think people want to feel good about themselves and show how many words they put out in a book sometimes. And I think sometimes less is more. And I felt like I got that from a lot of what I was reading.
Well, thank you. I want the poems to work on two levels. I want them to, you know, when you're sitting on the can and you read a poem or two and you get a smile and it hits you immediately. And I want that same poem to later on when you're opening a can of beer in front of the fridge to go, holy shit, that's what he meant. So I
Yep.
want them to hit you on two different levels. And you know, they and I appreciate that you could recognize it, that they sound readable and relatable. And Jack Kerouac once said that walking on water wasn't built in a day. And what he meant was that making it look easy is not that easy.
Oh yeah.
It's certainly not. Yeah.
Yeah, I know we're going to be running up against time here, but I wanted to read one more short one.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Fine,
yeah.
sure.
Yeah, we have plenty of time. Yeah.
Again, another short one. It says, he said, it's like that moment just before drowning. You're not under the water and you're not out of the water. The only thing you know is you're not dead yet.
So
no, Peter, I have this one. Sorry, I'm sorry, PJ. I don't want to forget. So, in my emails with John, he sent me. And PJ, you'll appreciate this. So he sent me. So John wrote poems, and then this Swedish artist, hopefully I'm pronouncing their name correctly, Jan Carlson. I mean, that's how pronounced.
I think it's Jan, but
Jan. That probably makes sense. So Jan Carlson, and I guess when I post the video, I'll put up the artwork. But I'm just curious, like, how does it feel to see, like, Peter, you're like, I mean, you've written stories, but to see someone else take your writing and then they create it and they make an image out of it. I mean, how does that feel? And like, I mean, my God, I mean, is that what you envisioned too? Like, I mean, you know, how was it? You know,
that was Jan and I did a book together called As Real as Rain. Unfortunately, it was the biggest flop either he or I ever had, but we still loved it. The premise was he went through my published books and he picked out a shitload of poems and he illustrated them. And, you know, he put his take on the poems and it was like this. We just loved the result, but readers didn't know what to make of it. It was not, since it was illustrated, it wasn't a kid's book, and adults thought it was a kid's book, so nobody bought it, and the book died. But I'm still very proud of that, and I hope one day it'll get reprinted.
So that actually brings as a great segue to the question I wanted to ask you. You said it's not a kid's book, but adults saw illustrations and felt like it was a kid's book. But you wrote a children's book, right? Did you feel like you had to change how you write to make it more palatable for kids, or did you write the same way, but the subject matter just happened to be something more relatable for children?
Good point. And yes, it was a more relatable subject. But when I wrote it, I wanted it to be, you know, I aimed high. I wanted it to be like The Little Prince. I wanted it to be, it was the story of two dogs, Phoebe and Ito. And it was about the Phoebe thought she was a princess, not a dog. And it was about her learning that her doghood, being herself, was a very important thing. And that was my premise for my kids' book. I enjoyed writing it. I had a lot of fun writing it. I'll never write another one again because it was very, very difficult.
I was going to say that I feel like that would be harder to
Yeah,
write for
Yeah.
a children's book, because having to keep finding something that would keep a child interested and keep reading, the subject matter has to be appropriate, the language
Yep.
has to be a way
Oh.
that's understandable for kids. I feel like that would be an impossible task, and I can't self-edit myself down enough to
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
appropriate for kids. So I can imagine how difficult that would be.
Yep. I'm happy just writing my crappy little poems and putting them out in the world and seeing what happens.
Well, you call them crappy little poems, but I would say that they're much better than that, if you ask me. Not that I'm any authority on the subject.
Just going back to your book, The Streets, just other things I feel like I just have to get this out, just in terms of just, man, like, you just talk about like your grandparents and like just seeing her, like your grandmother with her hair down. She almost looked like a different person, you know? And I think, like, with my own grandparents, they're almost like a different like being. They're almost like mythology, like
Yeah.
these mythology creatures. You know what I mean? Like, they're from a different time period. You know what I mean? And they look different. They're from a different fashion. Everything is different, and they're just like, like, I mean, all my grandparents have passed away, so it's like a time machine for sure. And like, just the way you wrote about it was really beautiful, man.
I was thinking about that the other day. I'm 73 now. I can remember as a kid, and this just blew me away. As a kid, I could remember people who were born in the 1800s. Think about that.
Whoa, right?
Wow.
Yeah. And you also talk about. Oh no, go, John. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm.
Hey, I want to read something else from the book.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
People
please.
and other bad
Please do.
ideas, and well, no premise. I'll just read it. It's called The University Poet. The university poet had a beard and wore a t-shirt that read "Going Nowhere Fast." He read his poems with intensity and leaned against the bookshelf, stroking his beard and pausing in all the wrong places. His students loved him. The young girls thought he was hot, and he had an apartment down the street filled with an unfinished novel, dirty dishes, and dreams that would never come true. Yeah, I enjoyed this book, People and Other Bad Ideas. I was the publisher of the previous book of poems, 24 Poems. I was doing a podcast with her. They run a show, and she was talking about all my new stuff being all portraits of people. And she said, that should be your next book. And so I said, yeah, People. That's a great idea for a title. And she said, yeah, but you got to come up with a subtitle. So that's where And Other Bad Ideas came from.
I think it's a great name.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Let me do one more. You guys are paying the price now. You got me going. Here's one. Her mouth was a ruined white flower. She had to be 80 or more. But she stood there in the back of the room while I read my poems to a couple of dozen students who only looked tired and bored. I wasn't into it, and neither were they. And all I could see was this mop of stringy gray hair and a face that kept urging me on. That's my book, people.
Yeah.
You wrote a couple of times about teaching in those, right? Do you teach poetry? Are you do any sort of adjunct professoring in a?
No. I went to one semester of college.
Wow.
So that's as far as my education went. But I guess I'm self-taught. I read constantly. My wife says I've always got my nose in a book. But no, I never taught, and I don't have the patience to do it. How about you guys?
As a teacher, no, I'm not a teacher. my brother is. He's much more patient than I am.
Yeah.
I've done some training in a professional setting in the business world. I've done a
Uh-huh.
lot of training and facilitating, which is sort of close, I guess, to doing any sort of teaching. And I hate every minute of it.
Yeah.
It's not for me.
It's tough. It really is. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know how people can do it.
I don't know
Yeah.
how they can do it either. And I'm the kind of person where you don't want to learn from me because most of the time what I'm doing, whether it gets a positive or negative result, I'm just making it up as I go along. There's really no rhyme or reason for what I'm doing. I just hope for the best. So you don't want to learn from someone like me because you're not going to get a real roadmap of how to be successful. It's just going to be a lot of running into the tree until it falls down instead of running around it, I guess.
Well, that's a good point. Making it up as you go along. That's kind of my way of doing the poetry, because whenever I sit down and write something, whether it's a poem or a longer piece, if I have a point A and a point B figured out ahead of time, it never works out. But like jazz, if I let it follow its own route, like water going down a hill, then it's more successful. I've learned to trust my gut, and to just
Mm.
let the words, and let my own inner self tell me where it's to go.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I think, which is a good segue because I do teach. I'm a therapist, but on certain nights I teach coping skills, dialectical behavior therapy. And one of the things, like maybe you're very anxious and you're kind of getting, you can do some grounding techniques. There's tons of different kinds, but one of them, I work with substance use disorder folks, and coworkers that's mental health and they're suffering from substance use. But we talk about the Serenity Prayer. Which is a form of poetry. God grant me the serenity to accept the
Yeah.
things I cannot change, the
Uh-huh.
courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So even that can be very grounding for folks. So yeah, I'm not teaching things like textbooky, but but for some folks, those kind of poetry can definitely, for a lot of folks, writing to how they feel, journaling for sure can really help.
Yeah, it could be very cathartic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm reading a book right now by Anatole Broyard called Kafka Was the Rage. And
Mm,
it's a memoir of New York City in the 1940s. Really interesting. I think you might enjoy that.
yeah. There's two other poems that I want to read. I think one of them is printed, so I'm gonna not read that one, but I love that one. There's one that's called "He Found Her." It's a short one. He found her, far less glamorous and far more extreme than any woman he'd ever known. He was attracted, he was repelled, and he never could figure out why. Man, I've been there, brother. Um, I'm married now, but I get that, man. Shit, you know. And
Thank you.
yeah, and I think you have another. Mine kind of the way it printed out came out a little weird, but I like this one a lot because it's called Everyman. Maybe I will read it. It might be might be a little typo, but I used to be in a band, but our singer, I used to write lyrics. My brother did, but our singer was really, very excellent. He was like basically like you, could really write poetry. And anyway, we had a song called Everyman, different, but yours. And like I said, this is misprinted. I apologize, but so every man loves the smell of his own farts. Billings was different. His were so bad he had to get up and leave the room. That's probably why he never got married. It was horrible. No woman stayed very long. Even his dog ran away. Twice. Which is okay with Billings. He didn't mind being alone. He liked being quiet, and it gave him time to think. No one liked his music either. His life, for Billings, was almost perfect. If he could only get used to the smell of his own farts. Oh, man.
Yeah.
I love it. And I think John and our emails going back and forth. You got a flair for comedy, man. So I really encourage you to keep going that route, man.
Well, that's for guys who write poetry, the ones who call themselves poets. They take take themselves too seriously. I take the
Mm.
work seriously, but I don't take myself seriously. And I can make the same point by making the reader smile and then go, aha, that's what he meant. So throwing a little humor into that uh, is a big aid, a big help for me.
Yeah.
I could definitely see that. I have one more question for you actually, because you said you were reading a book. Now, when you're writing, do you continue to read other books that come out or other books of poetry or novels, or do you stop reading stuff so that you can make sure whatever thoughts you have are your own and it's not influenced by what you're reading?
That's a good point. Early in my career, I used to stop, and just through habit and getting good at what I'm doing, I don't have to stop anymore. I could separate those two things. So I can continue reading whether I'm reading Proust or whether I'm reading Stephen King. It doesn't matter. My writing stays true to me. And that's always when I talk to kids who want to be writers, I say it's very important for you to develop a voice.
Mm.
The best example I could give is, a musician. When you hear Carlos Santana, you know it's Santana.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Or if you hear BB King, you know it's BB King. You have to get a voice, and for a writer, you can tell when it's Stephen King that you're reading, or you can tell when you're reading James Joyce. Those people have voices, and I've tried to develop my own voice, and I think I'm starting to get there.
Yeah. So John, before we wrap up, like I said, I just want to end with this quote from that film, Dead Poet Society.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. To quote from Whitman, "Oh me, O life of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish, what good amid these, O me, O life?" Answer, that you are here, that life exists and identity, that the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. That the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. What will your verse be?
But John, that's like, look, that's your spirit, man. Your homework assignment at the lunch table is to watch that movie. Okay, so
This is
but
good. I've had a blast talking with you guys. You don't take yourself seriously. This is a lot of fun. And one last movie I wanted to talk about briefly.
Of
We
course.
talked about our favorite movies. A 1944 Ray Milland movie. I don't know if you know it. I hope you do. The Uninvited.
I know it. I know of it and have not seen it. Hmm.
Oh, you have to see it. It's one of the greatest, probably the greatest ghost story ever put in the film. I just really love that. And I can talk movies all day with you guys. Silent movies. I love silent movies.
Yep.
Have you ever seen The Passion of Joan of Arc?
No.
Yes, I have. I've seen a lot of movies that typically people don't always know about because, like I said, when I was in school for like I said, one for film, I had to take a lot of film history courses, and a lot of the classes had you watch some stuff that was off the beaten path a bit, and so
Uh-huh.
I'm familiar with a lot of different movies.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Uh,
the only silent film I remember watching when I didn't go for film, I went for social work, but I did take social work and film. At least I saw The Kiss with Greta Garbo. That was
that's
cool.
great.
Yeah.
Garbo's probably my favorite my favorite silent actor, and boy, I could talk about her all day. And then when she went into silence, and she brought John Gilbert, who was by then a big drunk, and he was
Mm.
on the outs with the studios, and she brought him in to do, oh, I forget the name of the movie. Shit. Queen Christina. You have to see
Mm.
Queen Christina. That's the one with the famous closing shot with her standing at the helm of the wheel of the ship. And the
Okay.
director, it might have been King Vidor, who told her, when you look out, empty your mind and think of nothing. And it's a famous closing shot with just a close-up of her. Great movie, Queen
Cool.
Christina, with Greta Garbo and John Gilbert.
Yeah, I'm writing this stuff down. Yeah.
That's a perfect way for us guys to close with
Yeah.
Greta Garbo and John Gilbert and Queen Christina.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Of
you
course.
so much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John,
Hey.
we just want to thank you for coming on our show and talking to us for a bit here and getting to know you. We really appreciate your time, and we want to also plug where we can get your books. So we're gonna have the links and such on our show notes and things like that. But is there anything specific you want to plug or tell the folks listening at home?
No, just get People and the Other Bad Ideas and a copy of The Street. They're on Amazon. To get The Street, that's really weird. You have to look up my name under books. If you just look up my name, it won't show up for some reason. So you got to look under books. But any of my books on Amazon, not for me because I'm not going to get rich off my books, but for these small publishers that scratch every day to stay in business. Buy the books and support them. I'd really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely, folks. If you're looking for something to read, definitely pick up one of John's books. And we're gonna have all the links, like I said, on our website, our show notes. So we'll make it nice and easy for you to find it. So if you search for it and you can't find it on Amazon, you just gotta click the link and it will take you right there.
And
Yep.
if you do, double espressos on me.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, thanks again, John. It was awesome. We gotta have you back at the lunch table. For movies, books, anything. So it was really
Anytime
cool.
you guys want me, I'm there.
Great.
Okay.
We'll definitely have you back. And then I think I hear the bell ringing, so it's time to get to class.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
Same
you.
time, same table.
Have a good one.
See you, buddy.
Boys and girls, lunchtime is over. For more information, visit their website at coolkidslunchtable.podbean.com. Follow the boys on all social media platforms. Just search Cool Kids Lunch Table Podcast. Now get to class before you get detention.